warfare is a tool that has been used by many inferior forces in history to bog down and outlast countless superpowers, but it is very much glamorized and misunderstood. So let me give you a little bit of context. At the time of the American Revolution, Great Britain didn't just have an army, it was the army. Disciplined, professional, and built on generations of warfare. They were trained to fight in formation, lines of men standing shoulder to shoulder, delivering synchronized volleys with precision. Now at the time, it was the pinnacle of conventional warfare. On the battlefield, the outcome was very much predictable. You didn't outshoot them, you did not outdiscipline them, and you definitely didn't outlast them. You simply lost. Now this was very true for full-blown militaries, but for the civilian colonists, it wouldn't have even been a fight. It would have been a firing squad. And some of the American rebels knew this, and they adapted with some very different tactics at the time. Now, drawing from previous experiences, those farmers, blacksmiths, and tradesmen, they took a page from the Native American field book, and they fought like savage hunters. Now, these Indians were smart enough to hide behind trees, use terrain, ambush a convoy, and target the officers. So instead of forming lines in an open field, they took to the woods, fired from cover, and retreated to fight again tomorrow. Now, to the British, this was outright dishonorable, undisciplined, and immoral. In their eyes, this wasn't how war was supposed to be fought, but it worked. Now, at places like Lexington and Concord, British troops marched in formation. They expected resistance that they could actually see, measure, and fire on. Instead, they were harassed and picked off the entire way back. Shots from tree lines, from behind stone walls, and from angles that they couldn't predict. There was no formation to break, there was no line to charge, and no clear enemy to engage. Just consistent pressure from something that they couldn't identify or pin down. And for the colonists, it proved a point. You do not need to be stronger or smarter. You need to be more adaptive and more willing to fight dirty. Well, the big takeaway is you do not meet the empire on the field, and you don't fight their way. You bleed it from the edges. And it's worth noting that the successful skirmishes are the parts that you find in history books, Hollywood, and heroic storytelling. The part where a smaller, less equipped force can outthink and outmaneuver a juggernaut. But what gets left out is what it actually takes to live that way, to fight that way, and to survive long enough for it to even matter. So today we're going over the key aspects that determine success or failure for a guerrilla force. Now, we'll use history as a reference, and hopefully we can gain some insight so as to better understand how foolish or capable a small force can be when going up against those with greater supplies, tools, and manpower. Now, if you want the short version, here it is. The guerrilla is the underdog. His or her life is suffering. They are always hunted, and anyone who helps them or is associated with them will be in the crosshairs. And if the guerrilla isn't fit or can't self-sustain or blend in, they will quickly die. If you want to go deeper, let's actually define what a guerrilla fighter is, and then we will move on to what makes a guerrilla force successful.
This Dirty Civilian production is powered by a few incredible companies focused on building capable, prepared Americans. Wetworks. Every spring and summer, we bust out the summer combat hoodie from Wetworks. It's built to keep you covered without cooking you alive. Lightweight material, breathable, and designed for movement, whether you're training, working, or on an exercise in the field. It gives you that extra layer of concealment and protection without all the bulk. And it comes in both zip-up and solid hoodie version. If you're operating in the heat and humidity, this is one of those go-to pieces of gear.
Steel Industries. Night vision is expensive, and more importantly, it's confusing. That's why we like Steel Industries. You're not just buying gear, you're talking to people who actually understand it and will walk you through what you need, and what you don't. No upsell nonsense, no guessing, no wasting money on the wrong setup. If you're getting into night vision and want to do it right the first time, talk to Steel Industries.
Your phone is a surveillance device, a personal propaganda unit, and always pulling for your attention. And with smartphones these days, they are never really turned off. That means your location, your data, your signals, they are always out there, always talking, whether you want them to or not. That's why we use Silent. Their Faraday bags cut the connection completely. No signals in or out. When it goes in the bag, it is actually off. No tracking, no noise, no compromise. So if you want to live like it's the 90s again, this is how you get there. Stay ready outdoors. Buying prepackaged survival kits can be a great idea until you figure out that the supplier saved money on key items like a fire starter kit or a signaling device. That's where Stay Ready Outdoors comes in. They don't cut corners. The gear is built around real-world use, reliable fire, dependable water solutions, and medical that you can actually trust when it counts. No filler items, no gimmicks, just equipment that works when you need it. Because when something goes wrong, you do not need subpar equipment. You need quality. Go to Stay Ready Outdoors.
So what is a guerrilla? A guerrilla is a term that derives from Spain, when Spanish and Portuguese civilians used unconventional and non-militaristic tactics against the French when Napoleon invaded. It just means little war. Guerrilla fighters refer to a small, irregular force using tactics such as ambushes, sabotage, raids, petty war, hit and run, and even terrorism. Now, as you'll see, this style of fighting can also be used by established militaries as well. But if you need an example of guerrilla warfare, just go watch the original Red Dawn, not the new one, or movies like The Patriot, and you're gonna really get a good sense for what this could look like. Now, even still, The Patriot displays more of an insurgency that is employing guerrilla tactics. There is a difference between insurgency and guerrilla warfare that we should also clarify before we move on. An insurgency is a movement built up with an end goal of collapsing and replacing a government or a political system with their own government or political system. Now, these could have religious, social, or economic ties that contrast what is already in power. And you could say that the Americans in the Revolution was a form of insurgency, but you could also argue that there wasn't an established government here yet, so a better example of an insurgency is Mao Zedong bringing his communist regime to power, or more recently, the Taliban insurgency using terror to force Sharia law on the world, as well as eradicate Western values from the world. Now, guerrilla warfare, on the other hand, is a tool or a method of warfare where strategically weaker, more mobile, and independent forces use surprise attacks to harass a superior conventional army. They're often supported by local populace. Well, this tactic is usually used by smaller forces because it is their only course of action. But it can be employed by nearly any force, no matter how big or small. An example of this is the ODA Team 595 that got sent into the mountains of Afghanistan right after 9/11. These Green Berets didn't go to fight alone. They didn't build up a big fort or incorporate hundreds of conventional infantry soldiers. They partnered with the Northern Alliance and used a small team who knew the terrain and already had a pre-established network. And technically, the Northern Alliance who were fighting the Taliban were the guerrillas, and the ODA team were the force multiplier. So let's dive deeper and talk about rule number one for any successful guerrilla force: never fight fair. Now, the reason unconventional warfare is often not used by Western forces is because it is not the easy way to fight. It is the underdog strategy, and you will subject yourself to scavenging resources, reduced firepower, and diminished security. Now, because of this, most guerrilla forces appear more of a nuisance than a threat when it's compared to their foe. In this case, going toe-to-toe with a full-fledged army would undoubtedly result in the destruction of the inferior force. So successful teams cannot fight fair. They can't engage in prolonged firefights, and they have to use disciplined, strategic, and disrespectful styles of war. And history is riddled with these examples. Now, one of these examples would be the Viet Minh during the Vietnam War, and in this case, the US had far superior firepower, but it could only be used when the North Vietnamese were located and identified. Now, the Viet Minh knew this, and they simply refused to meet Western forces on the battlefield unless it was on their terms. They heavily relied on ambushes, booby traps, and small unit attacks. They would often ambush and then run away so as to live and fight another day. If they did pursue in the thick jungle, it would be calculated and strategic. Unless they had superior and overwhelming firepower, they would create as much damage as they could and then slip back into the dark jungle. Now, in this example, they didn't try to beat American firepower. For the most part, they just made it irrelevant. This was the same style of combat that Francis Marion used against the British during the Revolutionary War. Marion earned the name Swamp Fox. And while he never commanded a field army or won a massive conventional battle, his 2-year campaign in South Carolina tied down British forces, disrupted supply lines, and helped shift the Southern theater toward American victory. And he is considered one of the fathers of modern guerrilla and maneuver warfare. And his tactics are still studied today. Now, his greatest achievement was at Parker's Ferry in the swamps of South Carolina during the American Revolution. Francis Marion understood something that most conventional commanders did not. If you are weaker, the worst thing that you can do is fight like you're stronger. Now, Marion had no formal supply chain, no standardized equipment, and no ability to stand toe-to-toe with British forces in open ground. What he did have was a small group of highly mobile militia that was deeply familiar with the terrain. Being mobile and comfortable with the terrain is a really big deal here. Now, the area around Parker's Ferry wasn't just a crossing point, it was a choke point. Movement through South Carolina lowcountry was dictated by rivers, swamps, and narrow causeways. And if you controlled those movement corridors, even temporarily, you didn't need a large force. You just needed to know when and where your enemy would pass through. Now, Marion and his men lived in this environment. They moved through the terrain that British troops struggled to even navigate. Swamps that slowed and exhausted regular soldiers were, to Marion's militia, a form of protection. They weren't just hiding in the terrain, they weaponized the terrain. Now, when intelligence reached Marion that British aligned forces were moving near Parker's Ferry, he didn't rush in to confront them. He didn't try to gather overwhelming numbers or prepare for a prolonged fight. Instead, he did what guerrilla fighters have always done when they understand their limitations. He strategized to make the fight unfair. Now, first came positioning. Marion selected ground that restricted movement, places where a column would be stretched out. Visibility would have been limited and maneuvering was nearly impossible. In swampy terrain, enemy forces would move into predictable paths. Then came concealment. His men did not form lines the traditional way. They didn't present as a visible force. They disappeared into the environment. Tree lines, brush, and swamp edges. The goal wasn't just to hide, it was to remain undetectable until the exact moment of violence. And timing was everything. And when it came, the violence was sudden and concentrated. His men struck and created immediate confusion, and this overwhelmed the enemy's ability to organize a response. There was no prolonged exchange of fire, there was no attempt to hold ground, and the objective wasn't destruction in the conventional sense. It was disruption, shock, and rapid disengagement. Now, the final and the most important part of the ambush came immediately after. They left. Before British forces could regroup and before they could fight or turn the fight into something even remotely fair, Marion's militia vanished back into the concealment that was hiding them in the first place. To the enemy, it would have felt like being sucker punched by a ghost. And the results were 120 British dead and another 80 wounded, while Marion's band only had 1 killed and 3 wounded. Now, this is a great history lesson, but what can we actually learn from this story? Well, in order to become more effective, these men had to resist the urge to fight the way that they had learned. And I'm sure that they too understood formations and doctrine when it came to combat at the time. But they had to flip the script. They had to incorporate some foundational rules and then develop their own SOPs and standards. And as soon as they fell back into the traditional ways, they would have been destroyed on the battlefield. Also, they weaponized terrain. Now, there's a few ways to do this, but for the guerrilla, it almost always means becoming very familiar with uncomfortable locations like swamps, marshes, and snow-blown mountaintops. Now, it's one thing to win a battle in the swamps. It's another thing to hide, survive, and struggle in a swamp with snakes and mosquitoes for months on end, only to shoot a few rounds and then run back off. Additionally, the way that Marion and his men fought was not viewed as honorable warfare. It would have been viewed as worse than a rebellion. It was like stacking federal crimes on top of war crimes on top of moral abandonment and then murder. So in order to make guerrilla warfare even viable, people need to end up in a dark place, develop tactics where they leverage an enemy's weakness and somehow be willing to think outside the box. And when Marion did this, he painted a big target on his back. With that in mind, let's move on to rule number 2, which is movement and blending in. As referenced before, the guerrilla is more of a nuisance than overt threat, as studied in the book War of the Flea. And they need to be careful to not overstretch or overreach their actions and bring too much attention to themselves. But eventually, if the guerrilla force survives long enough, that larger force will begin hunting and investigating so as to destroy their enemy. But just like what we saw in Vietnam, the enemy has to be located and identified first. So here's a little example for you. In nature, there are often 2 key defense mechanisms. One is to be strong and powerful and overtly dangerous, a boisterous show of force that can often deter a foe from an attack. The other is becoming the chameleon. Now, a successful, unconventional force can't have a known home base. They can't have armed guards or watchtowers, and if they did, they would be bombed and destroyed overnight. Instead, they have to become that chameleon, blend in, and move amongst the crowd, no matter where they are. Now, this matters because you cannot look tactical, appear powerful, or show any signs of capability. Now, an example of this in history is the French resistance during World War II, and they did this very, very well as they were operating under constant surveillance against secret police and a powerful Nazi regime who would immediately execute them if they were ever captured. This means everyone working the resistance was surviving by constantly managing instability and potential interrogation. At any time, they would need an alibi or an explanation for their own actions. But the biggest weakness for a force like the French resistance was their own countrymen and their families. See, if someone wants to identify a hidden force, the easiest route is through people who know the details. Now, the Nazis used two kinds of tactics to draw out information. One is they would coerce individuals through gifts, supplies, power, and security, all in trade for information. The other was oppression, torture, or fear of execution if no information was provided. So while blending in is the best strategy, you are also forcing your community and your family into the conflict, whether they know it or not. Now, a way to protect your family and your community is to develop nomadic behavior. In some cases, this works, but a force would also need to blend into a culture and a society that they're moving into. And additionally, without favor from the populace, new faces would stand out, and common individuals could easily turn in a group of would-be thugs for a reward. And this is exactly how Che Guevara got caught. Che started out running a successful communist insurgency in Cuba alongside Fidel Castro, but later, when he moved into Bolivia, he failed to make the Bolivian people feel like the revolution was their revolution. He had no support, no network, no benefit from the villagers, no recruiting base, and no free supplies or intel. The villagers were reporting guerrilla movements, denying assistance, and supporting the Bolivian military. Eventually, through the support of local villagers, Che's location was identified, and then with the help of US forces, the Bolivian military captured him alive, moved him to another village, interrogated him briefly, and executed him the next day. Now, where this was done successfully was in Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires. Now, many superpower militaries like Great Britain, Russia, and even the US have struggled or outright failed to conquer terror cells in Afghanistan because of their little war techniques. Now, during the Soviet-Afghan War, the Mujahideen were constantly moving in and through the brutal mountain terrain. They would hit out of nowhere and then disappear into the mountains or back to a small village that would provide security and shelter. Now, if the Soviets retaliated and slaughtered an entire village, it would only turn the villagers into martyrs for the cause and inspire new recruits for the guerrilla fighters. So once again, it wasn't that the Soviets were incapable of winning a fight, it's that there wasn't a fight available to win. But without in-depth knowledge of the terrain, a willingness to risk their own family's life, and superhuman fitness levels, the Mujahideen wouldn't have stood a chance. Oh, and also, to be fair, the US was funding the war and providing crazy amounts of arms and supplies to the Afghans, only to have those supplies be used on us years later. But that's a whole nother story. The key takeaway here is guerrilla warfare doesn't fail because it doesn't work. It fails when combat alone is the only strategy. If a force has low fitness levels, low terrain knowledge, and is easily identifiable, then they are sprinting toward failure. Additionally, if they are involved in nefarious actions, they have to know that staying with their family will put their family in the crosshairs. If they leave their family, then they're going to leave them unprotected as well. Movement and blending in is mandatory, and security is probably not going to be available. So with that cheery thought, let's move on to the final point, which is the supply chain. Now, there are a few terms that are often used around every military in history that refer to sustainment and logistics and the importance of them. Napoleon said, "An army marches on its stomach." Omar Bradley, "Amateurs talk about tactics, but professionals study logistics." Heinz Guderian, you guys can pronounce that. Logistics is the ball and chain of armored warfare. And in modern Army field manuals, operations are constrained by sustainment, and on and on and on. Now, if you haven't figured out where I'm going with this, what most people don't realize about guerrilla warfare is that fighting is kind of the easy part. The hard part is the other 99%. See, conventional forces are built on logistics, food, ammo, medical, communication, transportation. Everything is a part of a system, and if that system works, then the force works. Guerrilla warfare does not have that luxury unless you have the backing of the United States, because apparently we collect enough tax dollars to fund every war possible. Actually, we don't. We're in a whole lot of debt. But if you don't have help of the United States, then there are no resupply convoys, no scheduled deliveries, there's no QRF, and there's no medical centers to help you. There is no guarantee that tomorrow you're gonna eat, hydrate, or reload. Everything becomes your responsibility. You carry what you can, you cache what you can't. And when that runs out, you improvise. Now, running out of supplies is unfortunately a common situation in warfare as a whole. A brutal example of this was the Japanese Imperial Army struggling to survive on the Philippine Islands at the end of World War II. Their naval supply routes were destroyed, airdrops were out of the question, and quickly, the men on the ground fell into survival mode. Soldiers were eating leather equipment, a handful of rice per day, or foraging for roots, but it wasn't enough to survive on. Additionally, they were operating in the thick, humid jungle with lava rock and ocean air. Any cut, scrape, or wound was quickly infected, and without medical resupply, they just continued to fall apart. Those with bushcraft skills and a will to live carried on with a cultural standard of no surrender. And one man even hid in his post until 1974, a whole 19 years after the war had ended. Now this highlights the need for supplies and self-sustainment for both conventional as well as unconventional forces. The difference is that the guerrilla has to go into every situation knowing that there is no resupply on the way. There is no one on the other end of that radio waiting to drop a crate of MREs or fresh iodine tablets for your water. Now, with this being the case, it is no wonder why most guerrilla forces throughout history don't die in battle. They die from exhaustion, starvation, exposure, or being forced into a bad fight because they ran out of resources. But if the guerrilla has a secret community that can shelter, supply, and inform them, then they have a chance of outlasting the superior force. And with all that being said, let's close this out with a few final thoughts. So guys, at the end of the day, guerrilla warfare sounds appealing from a distance. I mean, who doesn't love the idea of Green Berets dropping from the sky behind enemy lines to survive, sabotage, and undermine a powerhouse? Small teams, freedom of movement, and outsmarting a larger force. It sounds sick. But when you actually break it down, it is not heroic, it's brutal. That is even more so true when you consider the fact that Army SF are often reliant on support from above. For most of the world, that is not the case. You don't fight fair. You don't stay in one place. You are your own resupply. You're constantly moving, constantly hiding, constantly one mistake away from being found and destroyed. And sure, history shows us that this kind of warfare can work, but it also shows us something more important. Most people are not prepared for what this would actually require. Not physically, not mentally, and not logistically. Definitely not societally. Because whether you like it or not, conflict like this is not fought alone. Survival depends on people, terrain, discipline, and time. Lose any one of those, and it's just not gonna work. So while it's easy to fantasize about being the guy in the mountains, the reality is if you're working and preparing to be ready for this kind of conflict, then good on you. You've made it this far. Now it's time to think about bigger considerations. Things like what kind of skills or logistics you may actually need to survive. Skills like bushcraft, water purification, fitness, social support, vehicle maintenance, and even knowledge of your own home terrain. And like we've always said, we pray that these skills and this kind of capability is never needed. But history shows that peace is actually quite rare. Now, one closing thought for you guys, because guerrilla warfare goes both ways. If you were to attack a superpower like America, would you even poke the bear or awaken the sleeping giant with attacks, like physical attacks? Would you invade with guns and tanks? Or would you go to war a different way and do things like blackmail elected officials, flood the streets with drugs, generate a fear campaign through social media, discourage trust in the elections, and pay the young people to make and consume brain rot? See, American strength is its firepower. From the Marine Corps to our grandmas, we are armed. But what is our weakness? And what is your weakness? Now guys, you may be wondering why we're diving into the topic of guerrilla warfare as a whole. We've touched on this concept in fun ways on the channel, but let me just try and answer the question that I posed for you a moment ago, which the question was, what is our weakness? What is America's weakness? And then the next thing that we should be asking is, what can we do about it? So I would say that our biggest weakness here in the United States is our community, or lack thereof. Sharing common ground, common morals, and an idea of what America should become or stay as. Now, what can we do about it? Well, not posting on Reddit, not spending time even responding to YouTube comments, even though we appreciate that. One of the best things that you can do in order to build structure here in America and resist influence on Some of the bad things that are going on here in the West is just building relationship with your neighbors, with your friends, with your family, getting off the video games, not going to the flat range, but going out and having dinner with like-minded individuals, spending time with your family and your community, learning from the older and the wiser generations as well, because those are the kind of things that actually got us what we have here in America. The founding fathers, they didn't just simply go to war. No, they started with a foundational, shared collective idea on what they stood for and what they were trying to generate, even with their own death. Even in their own death, they knew that it was worth trying to make this America. So again, starting with a community, starting with a baseline of morals and ethics and returning to that is one of the most important things that we can do, even if conflict never actually comes. Because today, picking up a rifle and doing things with that rifle is not an appropriate course of action. But what we can be doing is building community. Oh, there he is, there's his head, over there. Yeah, dude, he just got his world rocked.